So, like, whenever I enter a discussion about immigration and nationalism, I find it really useful to put myself in the shoes of the Australian Aboriginal or the Apache Indian, right? Because what is Australian nationalist identity and what is Australian culture has been changing so fast, right? That you have to come to the conclusion that there's no such thing. And so we have these absurd situations in Australia where second generation immigrants are saying, stop the boat people, stop the boat people. And then imagine you're an Aboriginal and you see some white dude in Australia saying, stop the boat people, right? You know, like the level of absurdity is off the charts, right? And so I always put myself in the position of the Australian Aboriginal, and I understand that nationalism is nonsense. It's nonsense on stilts. And as Prada was hinting, right, the age of nationalism was where people created fake nations in order to create stability. And Ukraine is the perfect example of that in the modern time.
Yes, out of space.
Right, well, no, but here's the interesting thing about Ukraine. Not only is Ukraine a very recently created nation, it was created by the Soviet Communist Party out of pieces of countries that were being punished after the Second World War. The Soviet Communists took a large part of Russia, they took a little bit of Romania, they took a little bit of Hungary, and they took a large part of what used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Poland. Now, Poland is also a fake nation. It was created out of the Austro-Hungarian
Don't
Empire.
say that loud, Toby, for the love of God.
Listen, I'm going to offend everybody here because what I'm saying is if you believe in nation, right, if you're a nationalist of any stripe, you're basically like, you know, cross between an insane man and a simpleton, because you don't have to think very hard to understand how stupid nationalism is. In the end, right, people have always migrated. In the beginning, there were nomads and they followed the seasonal food supplies. This idea that there is such a thing as a national identity, this is an artificial construct, right? And what I have seen in Australia, the hypocrisy of it is brutal. And in the end, what you're doing is you're asking people to conform to a fantasy, right? Now, if you can get everybody to do it, then you're going to get a cohesive culture. But it's going to be bloody, it's going to be violent, it's going to be oppressive, right? Because you're silencing everybody's story of their actual origins. And now you can see it very, very clearly in a country like Australia, but also America. And I think that, you know, what Waka said something very interesting before, which was the distinction between a melting pot and a salad bowl, right? And so if you want to create a nation, you have to melt everybody down into the new one thing. But see, that terrifies me, because who gets to say what that new one thing is, right? And what kind of person wants to create a new one thing? That's someone who has no respect for heritage, no interest in the variety of humanity's story. And it's a particularly soulless enterprise, right? It's a bit like treating everybody like they're just a component in the machine that you're putting together, right? It's a very, very aggressive way of treating other human beings. You know, this idea that your godlike vision of what should be the national identity should be forced on other people, because we shouldn't make any mistake. If you want to build a nation, right, it means you are forcing people to conform.
Yeah.
And so this is why I think, you know, when we talk about immigration and the problems of immigration, I find this pretty distasteful, because if you get 10 nationalists in a room together and ask them to define what is the nation and the culture, you're going to get 10 different answers. In the end, culture is something you scrape off the top of yogurt. And a human being is a human being no matter where they come from. And so I think it's kind of anti-human to embrace nationalism as the answer to humanity's problems.
If you ask that question,
how you create your fantasy, you know.
If you ask a question about asking a question about nationalism in France, so maybe you'll get 10 different answers, but they'll all be in French though. And the scatter or the variation between those answers is going to be existing in a context that, like, you know, incorporates their views of, like, I don't know, Napoleon a couple centuries before, and the revolution and what, like, there is a context that people are operating under. And this is, it's that sort of thing where you won't have a single idea, but you can definitely see that at times there's conflicts between ideas that are much further apart than where the discussion was before. We see this in the US, where it's like people can have disagreements, and maybe imagine that, like, you know, decades ago we were disagreeing on like high level political ideas, but like the fundamental ideas of what is the truth or what is a man and what is a woman weren't things that we're disagreeing on. So it's that idea that you can have people operating in a shared context and have a lot less discord, because there's even like the disagreement is on some small kernel in the center, and there's so much around it that people just take for granted. That's all about like how you disagree, what's a valid way of argumentation, what's the role of power versus truth in the sort of conversation that you're having. So I can definitely, you know, I hear your point on the idea that sometimes these things are quite arbitrary, especially in new countries like Australia or America. But there is a thing that people are, well, there is a thing that exists that is sometimes loosely defined, but people have something in mind when they say, like, you know, if you say like Britain or something, you know, if you try and an idea of like tying that back from this succession of like political leaders, you even have some places where maybe it's not the exact same political unit. Like France is on like their fifth republic, and so it's not even the same form of government continually since the revolution, but you could still make some sort of claim to people of a shared history that can in some places go back to like 2,000 years ago when Julius Caesar is like crossing the Alps to go after them. It's just to say that it's not completely flimsy and as silly as, you know, an Australian who's essentially like Al Pacino at the beginning of Scarface, like sent over as a criminal to a place to, you know, inhabit it, versus someone who's been there for like, I don't know, someone who's speaking in a context that's been established and built up over like centuries and centuries.